Introduction. The subject of this lecture is paper, a material that appears very ordinary, very quiet, and very familiar. And because of this familiarity, it is often overlooked, even though it has shaped human thought, memory, and organization in a slow and persistent way. Paper is thin, light, and usually pale in color, and it carries marks that are meant to remain still. And because it does this so reliably, it has become deeply connected to learning, administration, art, and daily life. When we speak about the history of paper, we are not speaking about a single invention that suddenly appeared fully formed, but rather about a gradual process, one that unfolded slowly over centuries, with many small changes, repeated experiments, and careful refinements. This documentary will move slowly through that long development, allowing time to rest on each stage, to observe the context in which paper emerged, and to notice how people interacted with surfaces meant to receive marks, symbols, and words. The approach will be calm and academic, and ideas will be repeated gently, because repetition helps understanding, and because the history itself unfolded through repetition, through repeated attempts to record information in stable and portable ways. Paper did not emerge in isolation, and it did not immediately replace earlier materials. Instead, it appeared within a long tradition of writing surfaces, each one responding to the needs of its time, and each one shaping how information was stored, shared, and remembered. To understand paper, it is necessary to first understand what came before it, and why earlier societies sought surfaces that could carry meaning without fading too quickly or becoming too difficult to transport. As we proceed, the pace will remain slow, and each chapter will stand on its own, examining one aspect of paper's development, as if in a quiet lecture hall, where time feels extended and attention is unhurried. Nothing here is meant to rush forward, and nothing is meant to conclude too quickly. Instead, the goal is simply to observe, to describe, and to allow the long history of paper to unfold in a steady and measured way. Chapter 1. Early human writing surfaces. Before paper existed, long before fibers were pressed and dried into thin sheets, humans still felt the need to leave marks behind, to record information, and to preserve memory beyond the moment in which it occurred. This desire to record and preserve did not begin with writing itself, but with symbols, images, and patterns placed carefully onto surfaces that could hold them for some amount of time. In the earliest periods of human history, natural surfaces were used, not because they were ideal, but because they were available. Stone walls, cave interiors, and rock faces became places where marks could be made, and these marks, often created with minerals, charcoal, or simple tools, remained visible for long periods. Stone was durable, heavy, and difficult to move, and yet it offered permanence, and permanence was valuable in a world where memory alone could fade. As societies grew more complex, the need for portable surfaces increased. Information was no longer only symbolic or ceremonial, but also practical, involving trade, ownership, laws, and communication across distance. Stone, while reliable, was not suitable for this expanding need, because it resisted movement and required effort to shape. Clay emerged as one of the earliest alternatives. Soft when wet and hard when dried or fired, clay could be shaped into tablets, marked with tools, and then preserved through heat. In regions such as Mesopotamia, clay tablets became central to administration and record keeping. They were not light and they were not flexible, but they allowed symbols to be impressed clearly and consistently, and this consistency mattered greatly. Clay tablets encouraged a particular kind of writing, one that involved pressing shapes into the surface rather than drawing flowing lines. This physical interaction between tool and material shaped early writing systems, reinforcing repetition, uniformity, and structure. Even here, the surface influenced the message, quietly shaping how language itself developed. Other materials were also explored. Wooden tablets appeared in various cultures, sometimes coated with wax, allowing marks to be made and erased. These surfaces introduced the idea of reuse, an important concept in the long history of writing materials. Wax tablets were temporary by nature, designed for notes, drafts, and calculations rather than permanent records. Animal skins, prepared carefully through cleaning and stretching, also became writing surfaces. These materials, later known as parchment or vellum, were more flexible than stone or clay and more durable than wax. They allowed ink to flow across the surface, enabling more fluid writing styles and longer texts. However, they were labor-intensive to produce and depended on animal resources, making them expensive and limited in availability. Plant-based materials also played an early role. Leaves, bark, and fibers were occasionally used, especially in regions where such materials were abundant. These surfaces were often fragile, vulnerable to moisture, insects, and decay, and yet they represented an important shift toward lighter and more adaptable writing materials. What connects all of these early surfaces is not perfection, but experimentation. Humans were testing the limits of what could hold meaning over time. They were learning, slowly and repeatedly, which materials endured, which could travel, and which allowed marks to remain legible. Each surface brought advantages and constraints. Stone offered permanence but resisted movement. Clay allowed clarity but added weight. Wood and wax introduced flexibility but sacrificed durability. Animal skins improved portability but demanded significant resources. Plant materials suggested lightness but often lacked longevity. These constraints did not discourage further development. Instead, they encouraged continued searching, continued refinement, and continued attention to material qualities. The idea of an ideal surface, one that was light, durable, writable, and accessible, remained distant, but it was quietly forming. By examining these early writing surfaces, we begin to see that paper did not appear suddenly or unexpectedly. It emerged from a long chain of material choices, each responding to human needs in specific contexts. The search for a better surface was slow, patient, and deeply connected to daily life. Even before paper existed, the conditions for its creation were already present. The desire for portability, the need for repeatable production, and the value placed on written records all shaped the environment in which paper would eventually appear. In this way, early writing surfaces were not merely predecessors, but foundations, quietly preparing the way for what would come later, without any sense of urgency, and without any awareness of what they were leading toward. Chapter 2. Papyrus in the ancient world. Papyrus occupies an important place in the long history of writing materials, not because it was perfect, but because it represented a careful and deliberate step toward lighter, more manageable surfaces for recording information. When papyrus began to be used in the ancient world, particularly along the Nile River in Egypt, it responded to very specific environmental and administrative needs, and it did so in a way that felt gradual rather than revolutionary. The papyrus plant grew abundantly in the wetlands of the Nile Delta, and this abundance made it a logical material to experiment with. The plant itself had a fibrous interior, and these fibers could be separated, layered, pressed, and dried to create thin sheets. This process was not fast, and it was not effortless, but it was repeatable, and repetition mattered greatly in administrative societies. Papyrus sheets were created by laying strips of the plant in perpendicular layers, moistening them, and pressing them together so that the natural sugars acted as a binding agent. Once dried, the result was a relatively smooth surface that could accept ink. The surface was not perfectly uniform, and it required skill to produce consistently, but it was lighter than clay and far more portable than stone. Because papyrus could be rolled, It allowed for longer texts to exist as continuous documents. Scrolls became common, and with them came new ways of organizing information. Text could now be unrolled gradually, read sequentially, and stored compactly. This physical form influenced how texts were written, structured, and preserved. In ancient Egypt, papyrus was closely connected to administration, religion, and education. Scribes trained for many years to master the techniques of writing and copying, and papyrus served as the medium through which knowledge moved slowly across generations. Legal records, religious texts, correspondence, and instructional materials all found a place on papyrus surfaces. The use of papyrus spread beyond Egypt through trade and cultural exchange. Greek and Roman societies adopted papyrus widely, valuing its lightness and relative convenience. In these cultures, papyrus became associated with literature, philosophy, and governance, quietly supporting the expansion of written culture. Despite its advantages, papyrus had limitations that became increasingly visible over time. It was sensitive to moisture, which meant that it survived best in dry climates. In humid environments, papyrus decayed quickly, losing its structural integrity and legibility. This environmental sensitivity restricted where papyrus could be reliably used. Papyrus was also fragile when folded, which encouraged the continued use of scrolls rather than bound books. Repeated rolling and unrolling caused wear, and edges could fray or split. These physical characteristics shaped reading habits, reinforcing linear reading and discouraging random access to different sections of a text. Production of papyrus required access to the plant itself, which gave Egypt a form of material control. Papyrus became a valuable export, and its distribution influenced political and economic relationships. The availability of writing material was never neutral, and papyrus demonstrates how material supply shaped knowledge access. Over time, alternative materials began to compete with papyrus, especially parchment made from animal skins. Parchment was more durable and less sensitive to climate, though it was more expensive to produce. As these alternatives gained popularity, papyrus slowly declined in some regions, though it remained in use for centuries. Papyrus represents an important stage in the gradual movement toward paper. It introduced plant-based sheet production, portability, and repeatability, even while retaining significant limitations. It was not paper, but it was closer to paper than anything that had come before. By lingering on papyrus, we see that the development of writing surfaces was never about sudden improvement. It was about trade-offs, about balancing durability, cost, accessibility, and practicality. Papyrus quietly carried human thought across time, even as its limitations pointed toward the need for something different, something slightly more adaptable, and something still yet to come. Chapter 3. Early paper in China. The earliest true paper emerged in China, and its development followed the same slow and deliberate pattern seen throughout the history of writing materials. Rather than appearing suddenly as a complete solution, early Chinese paper developed through experimentation, adaptation, and repeated refinement, responding to practical needs within a complex bureaucratic society. Before paper, Chinese writing relied on materials such as bamboo strips, wooden tablets, and silk. Bamboo strips were durable but heavy, and text required many strips bound together, making documents cumbersome. Silk provided a smooth writing surface, but was expensive and impractical for widespread administrative use. The need for a lighter, cheaper, and more flexible writing surface became increasingly clear as administrative demands grew. Record-keeping expanded, correspondence increased, and education required materials that could be produced in larger quantities. This environment encouraged careful experimentation with plant fibers and pulping techniques. Early paper was made from materials such as hemp, bark, rags, and plant fibers. These materials were soaked, beaten into pulp, suspended in water, and then lifted with a screen to form thin sheets. Once dried, the sheets created a flexible, lightweight surface suitable for ink. This process differed fundamentally from papyrus production. Instead of layering fibers intact, Chinese papermaking involved breaking fibers down and redistributing them evenly. This resulted in a more uniform surface, capable of being folded, stacked, and bound. Tradition often credits Kai Lun, an official of the Han dynasty, with formalizing papermaking techniques around the early 2nd century. While paper existed before him in experimental forms, Kai Lun's contribution lay in refining the process and promoting it within the imperial court. This institutional support helped paper spread more widely. Paper's advantages became quickly apparent. It was lighter than bamboo, cheaper than silk, and easier to produce in larger quantities. Its flexibility allowed for new book forms, including folded and stitched formats that differed from scrolls. The spread of paper within China was gradual. It did not immediately replace older materials, and for a long time, multiple surfaces coexisted. Different materials were chosen based on purpose, tradition, and availability. Papermaking became a skilled craft, passed down through generations. The quality of paper varied depending on fiber source, water quality, and production technique. This variation allowed paper to be tailored for different uses, from official documents to artistic expression. Paper also influenced writing itself. Brush techniques adapted to the absorbent surface, encouraging fluid strokes and expressive calligraphy. The relationship between tool, ink, and surface deepened, reinforcing paper's role in cultural life. By remaining within China for several centuries, papermaking matured slowly. Knowledge was refined, techniques improved, and the material became embedded in daily practices. Only later would paper begin its long journey beyond China's borders. Early Chinese paper was not merely a technological achievement. It was a response to social structure, administrative need, and material availability. Its success lay in its quiet practicality, its adaptability, and its ability to meet many needs without demanding attention. In observing the early history of paper in China, it becomes clear that paper emerged not as an innovation seeking admiration, but as a solution seeking usefulness. Its calm efficiency allowed it to spread slowly, carried not by excitement, but by steady, repeated use, setting the foundation for its gradual movement into the wider world. Chapter 4. The spread of paper across Asia. The movement of paper beyond its place of origin did not happen quickly, and it did not happen evenly, but instead unfolded through long periods of contact, exchange, and gradual familiarity. Paper travelled not as a dramatic invention, but as a practical material, quietly carried by merchants, monks, officials, and artisans, moving along routes where goods, ideas, and habits were already circulating at an unhurried pace. Within East Asia, paper spread first to regions that shared cultural, political, and linguistic connections with China. Korea and Japan encountered paper through diplomatic missions, religious exchanges, and scholarly contact. In these regions, paper was initially treated as a valuable and specialized material associated with learning, administration, and ritual use. In Korea, papermaking techniques were adapted to local resources. Plant fibers available in the region were tested, refined, and reused, producing papers with distinct textures and strengths. Paper became important for official records, Buddhist texts, and scholarly writing, and its production slowly became more widespread. In Japan, paper, known as washi, developed its own identity. Japanese papermakers placed great attention on fiber preparation, water purity, and careful handling. The result was paper that could be thin yet strong, suitable for writing, art, and architectural uses, such as screens and sliding doors. Throughout these regions, paper did not replace older materials immediately. Wood, silk, and bamboo continued to be used alongside paper, often chosen based on tradition or function. This coexistence allowed paper to integrate gradually rather than forcing abrupt change. As paper moved westward through Central Asia, its spread was closely tied to trade networks, particularly the Silk Road. Merchants carried paper as a commodity and as packaging, while travellers encountered it as a writing surface and as an administrative tool. Exposure led to curiosity, and curiosity led to imitation. One of the most significant moments in the westward spread of paper occurred during the 8th century, when Chinese papermakers were captured during conflicts and brought into Central Asia. These craftsmen shared their knowledge, intentionally or unintentionally, and papermaking began to take root in new regions. In places such as Samarkand, papermaking adapted again to local conditions. Fibres from linen and hemp were used, water sources differed, and production methods were adjusted. The resulting paper was not identical to Chinese paper, but it served similar purposes. Paper's appeal lay in its balance of qualities. It was light, making it suitable for transport. It was writable, supporting a wide range of inks and scripts. It could be produced in quantities that made large-scale documentation possible. As paper spread across Asia, it carried with it not only technique, but also changes in how information moved. Documents could be copied more easily. Texts could circulate more widely. Education and administration became less constrained by material scarcity. Despite these advantages, the spread of paper remained slow. Knowledge transmission required trust, training, and sustained practice. Papermaking was a craft, not a simple recipe, and it took time to master. Cultural attitudes also influenced adoption. Some societies valued older materials for their symbolic significance. Others viewed paper as too ordinary or too fragile for certain uses. These perceptions shaped how and where paper was used. Over time, familiarity replaced hesitation. Paper became less novel and more routine. Its presence expanded not because it demanded attention, but because it quietly fulfilled everyday needs. By the time paper reached the edges of Asia, it had already transformed from a localized innovation into a shared material culture. Yet even at this stage, its journey was incomplete. The westward movement of paper would continue, shaped by new languages, new scripts, and new social systems, each leaving subtle marks on how paper was made and used. Chapter 5. Paper in the Islamic world. The introduction of paper into the Islamic world marked a significant phase in its history, not because the material changed suddenly, but because the context in which it was adopted placed new demands upon it. As paper entered Islamic societies, it encountered a culture deeply invested in learning, administration, and the preservation of knowledge, all of which benefited from a reliable writing surface. Paper arrived in the Islamic world through Central Asia, particularly after papermaking had become established in cities such as Samarkand. From there, it moved into regions under Islamic rule, including Persia, the Middle East, and eventually North Africa. This movement was gradual, carried along trade routes and through centers of scholarship. Islamic societies quickly recognized the usefulness of paper. Compared to parchment, which was expensive and labor-intensive, paper offered a more accessible alternative. Its lower cost allowed for increased production of books, documents, and correspondence. Paper-making centers developed in major cities such as Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. These cities were already hubs of learning and administration, and paper supported their existing functions. Libraries expanded, record-keeping became more detailed, and written communication increased. Islamic papermakers introduced refinements to the process. They improved techniques for pulping fibers, often using linen rags as a primary source. They also developed methods for sizing paper with starches, creating smoother surfaces suitable for fine writing. Paper in the Islamic world was not only functional, but also aesthetic. Calligraphy held a central place in Islamic culture, and paper became the surface upon which this art flourished. The interaction between ink, pen, and paper was studied carefully, reinforcing the importance of material quality. Books produced on paper became more common, and bookbinding techniques evolved accordingly. Codices replaced scrolls more fully, allowing easier access to different sections of a text. This format supported scholarly study, comparison, and annotation. The spread of paper supported the translation movement, during which texts from Greek, Persian, and Indian traditions were translated into Arabic. Paper made it possible to copy and distribute these works more efficiently, contributing to the preservation and expansion of knowledge. Administrative systems also benefited. Tax records, legal documents, and official correspondence relied increasingly on paper. This reliance encouraged standardization in format and record-keeping practices. Despite its growing importance, paper did not eliminate other materials entirely. Parchment remained in use for important documents, and inscriptions continued on stone and metal. Paper found its place alongside these materials, chosen for its practicality rather than its prestige. The Islamic world played a crucial role in transmitting papermaking knowledge further west. As Islamic rule expanded into the Iberian Peninsula, paper production reached Europe. This transmission was not sudden, but it laid the groundwork for later developments. Paper's success in the Islamic world demonstrates how material adoption depends on social context. Paper thrived because it aligned with cultural values, emphasizing learning, documentation, and communication. Its spread was steady, reinforced by daily use rather than dramatic change. By the end of this period, paper was firmly established as a central material in Islamic societies. Its presence was no longer remarkable. It had become part of the ordinary infrastructure of knowledge, quietly supporting activities that unfolded at a measured and deliberate pace. Chapter 6. Paper reaches medieval Europe. When paper first entered medieval Europe, it arrived quietly, without ceremony, and without immediate acceptance. European societies already relied on established writing materials, particularly parchment made from animal skins, and this material carried with it a long tradition of authority, durability, and religious significance. Paper, by contrast, appeared unfamiliar, lighter, and at first glance, less reliable. Paper reached Europe primarily through contact with the Islamic world, especially via Spain and Sicily, regions where Islamic and Christian cultures met over long periods of time. In these border regions, Europeans encountered paper as a practical object, used for letters, records, and books, and slowly became accustomed to its presence. Early European reactions to paper were cautious. Parchment was seen as strong and long-lasting, while paper was sometimes viewed as fragile or temporary. Concerns existed about its durability, its resistance to moisture, and its suitability for important documents. Despite this hesitation, paper gradually found specific uses. It was adopted first for less formal writing, such as notes, drafts, and commercial records. Merchants appreciated its lower cost and lighter weight, which made record-keeping more manageable. As familiarity increased, so did confidence. European artisans began to learn papermaking techniques, often adapting methods learned indirectly from Islamic practices. The earliest paper mills in Europe appeared in the 12th and 13th centuries, particularly in Italy, France, and Spain. European papermakers relied heavily on linen and hemp rags as raw materials. These fibers were collected, sorted, soaked, and beaten into pulp, a process that required time, water, and careful labor. The availability of rags became a limiting factor, shaping production capacity. Water-powered mills introduced mechanical assistance to the pulping process. This innovation allowed for increased production while maintaining consistency. Even so, papermaking remained slow, repetitive, and dependent on skilled labor. Paper gradually moved into administrative use. City governments, courts, and universities began to accept paper for official documents. Its lower cost made broader documentation possible, expanding bureaucratic practices. Universities played an important role in paper's acceptance. Students and scholars needed affordable writing materials, and paper met this need more effectively than parchment. Lecture notes, commentaries, and copies of texts increasingly appeared on paper surfaces. Religious institutions were slower to adopt paper for sacred texts, often preferring parchment for its perceived permanence. However, even within monasteries, paper began to appear in supporting documents, correspondence, and educational materials. Paper's gradual acceptance illustrates how material change occurs through repeated exposure rather than immediate replacement. Trust developed slowly, reinforced by daily use and accumulated experience. Over time, paper became less novel and more routine. By the late medieval period, paper had secured a stable position in European society. It coexisted with parchment, serving different purposes based on context, cost, and tradition. Its presence expanded quietly, woven into the rhythms of administration, learning, and trade. Paper's arrival in Europe did not mark an endpoint. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new phase of adaptation, where local practices, resources, and technologies would shape its continued development. Chapter 7: Paper Mills and Craft Traditions. The growth of paper use in Europe led naturally to the expansion of papermaking as a specialized craft. Paper mills became centers of careful, repetitive labor, where raw materials were transformed into sheets through processes that rewarded patience and consistency. Early paper mills were often located near rivers and streams. Water was essential, both for powering a machinery and for preparing pulp. Clean, flowing water influenced paper quality, making location an important consideration. The collection of rags formed the foundation of European papermaking. Linen and hemp textiles, once worn and discarded, entered a new life as writing surfaces. This cycle connected everyday domestic life with scholarly and administrative work. Rags were sorted by quality, soaked, and then beaten into pulp using large wooden hammers driven by water wheels. This beating process broke fibers down gradually, producing a suspension that could be formed into sheets. The pace was slow, repetitive, and physically demanding. Papermakers used screens, often framed with fine wires, to lift pulp from vats. As water drained away, fibers settled into thin layers, forming individual sheets. Each sheet required careful handling to prevent tearing or uneven thickness. Once formed, sheets were pressed to remove excess water and then hung or laid out to dry. Drying was sensitive to weather, humidity, and airflow, introducing natural variation into the process. No two sheets were exactly the same. After drying, paper was often sized using gelatin or starch to reduce absorbency. Sizing improved writing quality, allowing ink to sit on the surface rather than bleed. This step reflected growing attention to usability and refinement. Paper mills operated within guild systems, where knowledge was passed from master to apprentice. Techniques were guarded carefully, and local traditions developed. Paper from different regions acquired distinct reputations based on texture, strength, and appearance. Despite mechanization through water power, papermaking remained deeply manual. Human judgment guided each step, from fiber preparation to drying time. This reliance on skill reinforced paper's status as a crafted material rather than a purely industrial product. Demand for paper continued to grow, driven by expanding administration, education, and commerce. Mills responded by increasing output, but growth was gradual and constrained by resources. Paper remained valuable, even as it became more common. The craft tradition shaped how paper was perceived. It was seen as reliable, adaptable, and practical. Its imperfections were accepted as part of its character. By the end of this period, paper mills were firmly established across Europe. They formed a quiet infrastructure supporting communication, learning, and record-keeping. Paper's presence was steady and unremarkable. Integrated into daily life without drawing attention, the stage was now set for further transformation. As demand continued to rise, pressures would emerge that challenged traditional methods, encouraging new approaches while retaining the calm continuity that had defined paper's long journey so far. Chapter 8: Printing and the demand for paper. The introduction of printing in Europe did not immediately transform society in a dramatic or sudden way, but it did place new and sustained demands upon paper, demands that unfolded slowly and steadily over time. Printing required repetition, not only in the ideas being shared, but in the physical process itself. And paper became the surface upon which this repetition could occur with consistency and relative efficiency. Before printing, books were copied by hand, a process that was slow, labor-intensive, and limited in scale. Each manuscript represented many hours of careful work, and the cost of production kept books scarce. Paper, even before printing, had already begun to lower these costs, making written material more accessible, though still limited by manual copying. With the development of movable type in the 15th century, particularly associated with Johannes Gutenberg, the need for large quantities of uniform writing surfaces became more apparent. Printing presses required sheets that could be produced in consistent sizes, that could withstand pressure, and that could accept ink without excessive bleeding or tearing. Paper mills responded gradually to these needs. Papermakers adjusted fiber preparation, sizing techniques, and drying processes to produce sheets better suited for printing. These adjustments were not abrupt innovations, but careful refinements made through repeated practice and observation. The relationship between printer and papermaker became increasingly close. Printers depended on reliable paper supplies, while papermakers relied on printers for steady demand. This interdependence encouraged standardization, though variation remained an accepted part of production. Printed books increased in number slowly at first. Early print runs were modest, and printed works often imitated the appearance of manuscripts to ease acceptance. Paper, in this context, served as a bridge between older traditions and emerging practices. As literacy expanded and universities grew, the demand for books increased. Religious texts, legal codes, academic works, and practical manuals all required paper. Each new reader represented not a sudden surge, but a gradual increase in ongoing consumption. Paper's role extended beyond books. Pamphlets, notices, and administrative forms became more common. Printing supported communication at a broader scale, and paper supported printing by offering a flexible and relatively affordable surface. Despite increased demand, paper remained a valued material. Waste was avoided, margins were narrow, and reuse was common. Scraps were saved, and damaged sheets found secondary purposes. The physical qualities of paper influenced printing practices. Ink formulations were adjusted to suit paper absorbency. Press pressure was calibrated to avoid damage. These interactions reinforced the importance of material understanding. Over time, printed paper altered how information moved. Texts could be replicated with greater consistency. Errors could be corrected across editions. Knowledge circulation became steadier and less dependent on individual scribes. Yet this transformation unfolded slowly. Handwritten manuscripts continued alongside printed books for generations. Paper supported both, adapting quietly to multiple roles without demanding exclusivity. Printing did not make paper extraordinary. Instead, it made paper ordinary in a new way, more present in daily life, more frequently handled, and more closely tied to routine intellectual activity. By sustaining printing over time, paper helped normalize the presence of written information. The written word became less rare and more familiar, carried quietly on sheets that passed from hand to hand, page by page, without ceremony. Chapter 9. Industrialization of papermaking. The industrialization of papermaking represents a gradual shift rather than a sudden break. A slow movement from craft-based production toward mechanized processes designed to meet increasing demand. This shift unfolded over centuries, shaped by population growth, expanded literacy, and the continued spread of printed materials. Traditional paper mills, while effective, were limited by manual labor and resource availability. As demand increased, these limitations became more apparent. Papermakers sought ways to produce more sheets with greater consistency while reducing reliance on skilled handwork. Early mechanizations focused on pulping. Water-powered hammers gave way to more efficient grinding and beating methods. These changes reduced processing time and allowed for larger volumes of pulp to be prepared. The development of continuous papermaking machines marked a significant change. Instead of forming sheets individually, machines could produce long rolls of paper that were later cut to size. This approach emphasized uniformity and speed. The introduction of wood pulp as a raw material further transformed papermaking. Rags had been a limiting resource, and their availability could not keep pace with growing demand. Wood, by contrast, was abundant in many regions and could be processed mechanically and chemically. Wood-based paper differed from rag paper. It was cheaper and easier to produce, but often less durable. These differences reflected trade-offs rather than clear improvements, and both types continued to be used based on purpose. Industrial papermaking facilities required significant infrastructure. Large machines, chemical treatments, and energy sources reshaped production environments. Papermaking became centralized, moving away from small local mills. Labor within paper production changed accordingly. Tasks became more specialized, and workers operated machinery rather than crafting individual sheets. Skill remained important, but its nature shifted toward maintenance and process control. The increased availability of paper altered consumption patterns. Paper became more disposable, used for newspapers, packaging, and everyday communication. This change occurred gradually, shaped by habit and convenience. Despite mechanization, attention to quality persisted. Different grades of paper were produced for different uses. Paper remained adaptable, responding to diverse needs without abandoning its fundamental characteristics. Industrialization did not erase earlier traditions entirely. Handmade paper continued in limited contexts, valued for its texture and durability. The coexistence of industrial and craft methods reflected continuity rather than replacement. Environmental considerations emerged slowly. Resource use, waste management, and pollution became topics of concern over time. These issues developed alongside industrial practices, not apart from them. The industrial phase of papermaking reinforced paper's role as an infrastructure material. It became woven into daily life at a scale previously impossible. Yet even at this scale, paper retained its quiet presence. Industrial paper did not announce itself as revolutionary. It simply appeared more often, in more places, supporting routines that unfolded day after day. Its success lay in its ability to remain unnoticed while remaining essential. As paper production expanded, it continued to serve as a foundation for communication, record keeping, and learning. The pace of its integration remained steady, consistent with its long history of gradual change. Chapter 10. Paper in Education and Administration. As paper became more widely available through industrial production, its role in education and administration expanded steadily. not through dramatic reform, but through gradual incorporation into existing systems that valued consistency, repetition, and documentation. Schools, universities, and administrative offices adopted paper because it aligned quietly with their needs, offering a surface that could be written on, duplicated, stored, and reviewed over time without demanding special attention. In educational settings, paper supported routine learning activities. Students used paper for notes, exercises, and examinations, repeating similar actions day after day. The physical act of writing on paper became part of the learning process itself, reinforcing memory through repetition and slow engagement. Teachers relied on paper to prepare lessons, record attendance, and assess performance. Paper allowed information to be fixed in place, reviewed later, and compared over time. This stability supported structured learning environments where progress was measured gradually. Printed textbooks became central to education. Paper enabled the wide distribution of standardized texts, ensuring that students across different regions could study similar material. This standardization did not remove variation, but it provided a shared reference point. Paper also supported informal learning. Personal notebooks, marginal notes, and copied passages reflected individual engagement with knowledge. These private uses of paper existed alongside formal instruction, illustrating its flexibility. In administration, paper served as the backbone of bureaucratic systems. Records of births, deaths, property, taxation, and legal proceedings depended on paper documentation. These records accumulated slowly, forming archives that reflected the passage of time. Administrative paper use emphasized clarity and consistency. Forms, ledgers, and registers followed repeated formats. This repetition reduced ambiguity and supported long-term organization. Paper's physical presence shaped administrative habits. Documents were filed, stacked, and stored, creating spatial systems of organization. Offices developed around the movement and management of paper. The growth of state institutions increased reliance on documentation. Paper supported communication between offices, regions, and officials. Letters, reports, and memoranda traveled steadily, carried by established networks. Paper's affordability encouraged thorough record keeping. More information could be recorded without concern for scarcity. This abundance supported accountability and reference. Despite its ubiquity, paper remained neutral in tone. It did not interpret information, but simply held it. Its role was passive, yet essential. Educational and administrative paper use reinforced habits of regularity. Writing, reviewing, and archiving became routine actions. Paper supported these routines without altering their pace. As generations passed, paper became inseparable from institutional memory. Decisions were justified through documents. Policies were preserved through records. This integration occurred quietly. Paper did not demand recognition. It simply remained present, ready to receive marks. By supporting in both learning and governance, paper became a stabilizing material. Its reliability allowed institutions to function predictably. Its simplicity allowed focus to remain on content rather than medium. Paper's role in education and administration illustrates its strength as an ordinary material. Through repeated use, it became foundational, shaping how knowledge and authority were expressed over time. Chapter 11. Paper in modern society. In modern society, paper continues to occupy a familiar and understated position, present in countless interactions, yet rarely noticed. Despite the introduction of digital technologies, paper remains woven into daily routines, reflecting habits developed over centuries. Paper appears in communication, packaging, art, and personal organization. Notes, letters, and printed materials persist alongside electronic alternatives. This coexistence reflects continuity rather than resistance to change. In offices, paper supports planning and reference. Documents are printed for review, annotation, and discussion. The tactile nature of paper influences how information is processed. Paper remains central to legal and official contexts. Contracts, certificates, and records often require physical copies. This reliance reflects trust built over long periods. In creative fields, paper offers a responsive surface. Artists, writers, and designers value its texture and immediacy. The act of marking paper carries a sense of direct engagement. Packaging represents another major use of paper. Boxes, labels, and protective materials rely on paper's flexibility and recyclability. These uses develop gradually alongside industrial distribution systems. Paper's environmental impact has become a topic of attention. Recycling practices, resource management, and sustainability efforts reflect evolving awareness. These concerns influence how paper is produced and used. Educational systems continue to balance digital tools with paper-based materials. Printed exams, workbooks, and handouts remain common. Paper supports focus and minimizes technological dependency. In personal life, paper supports organization. Calendars, lists, and journals persist. These practices emphasize reflection and planning. Paper's presence in modern society is not uniform. Its use varies by culture, profession, and preference. This variation reflects adaptability. Despite predictions of decline, paper endures. Its simplicity, accessibility, and reliability support continued use. Paper does not compete with technology, but complements it. Paper's role remains largely invisible. It does not attract attention unless absent. Its quiet service defines its value. By remaining familiar, paper continues its long history of steady support. It adapts without losing identity. It remains available, patient, and ordinary. Modern paper use reflects accumulated habits. Each sheet carries the weight of past practices, yet each use feels immediate and personal. Paper's story in modern society is one of persistence. It remains present, not because it must, but because it fits. Its integration continues at a calm and measured pace. Chapter 12. Paper in the Digital Age. The period often described as the Digital Age did not begin with the disappearance of paper, nor did it immediately alter the quiet presence that paper had established over many centuries. Instead, digital technologies emerged alongside paper, gradually introducing new ways to store, transmit, and access information, while paper continued to exist as a familiar and trusted material. Early digital systems were frequently described in contrast to paper. They were presented as faster, lighter, and less dependent on physical space. Yet even as these systems expanded, paper remained in use, often serving as a reference point against which digital tools were measured. In offices and institutions, computers introduced screens, keyboards, and databases, but paper did not vanish. Documents were still printed for review, signatures, and record-keeping. The transition was not abrupt, but layered with paper and digital formats overlapping in daily practice. Paper continued to support habits shaped by long familiarity. Reading on paper allowed for slow pacing, physical navigation, and visual rest. Many individuals found comfort in these qualities, returning to paper even when digital options were available. Digital storage promised permanence, yet paper retained symbolic authority. Printed documents were often perceived as more official or final. This perception was rooted in long experience rather than technical necessity. In education, digital tools expanded access to information, yet paper remained central. Students continued to write notes by hand, read printed texts, and complete written examinations. These practices reflected belief in the cognitive value of physical writing. Paper's role in planning and thinking also persisted. Sketches, diagrams, and drafts often began on paper. The open surface invited gradual development without constraint. In legal and governmental contexts, paper maintained a strong presence. Physical records were retained alongside digital copies. Redundancy provided reassurance rather than inefficiency. Paper adapted quietly to new roles. It became a bridge between digital systems and human habits. Printouts translated screen-based information into tangible form. Environmental awareness shaped discussions about paper use. Concerns about consumption led to efforts to reduce waste and increase recycling. These changes adjusted practice without eliminating the material itself. Paper's continued existence in the digital age demonstrates resilience. It persists not because it resists change, but because it accommodates it. Paper does not demand dominance. Digital technologies change rapidly. Paper changes slowly. This difference allows paper to serve as a stabilizing element. In daily life, paper remains present in subtle ways. Receipts, packaging, notes, and books continue to circulate. Their presence is routine and unremarkable. Paper in the digital age is not an artifact of the past. It is an active participant in the present. Its relevance is defined by use rather than novelty. By continuing to exist alongside digital systems, paper demonstrates a quiet adaptability. It absorbs change without urgency. It remains available. The digital age, rather than ending the story of paper, adds another layer to it. Paper continues, not as a relic, but as a companion, moving forward at the same unhurried pace it has always maintained. Closing. The history of paper unfolds without urgency, shaped by repetition, adaptation, and steady use, rather than by sudden transformation. Across centuries and cultures, paper has remained present by fitting itself gently into human activity. This presence has never depended on spectacle. Paper does not announce itself. It waits. From early writing surfaces to modern environments, paper has supported memory, communication, and organization through its reliability. Its qualities have remained simple, even as its contexts have changed. Paper has carried ideas quietly. It has received marks without judgment. It has preserved information without interpretation. The pace of its history reflects the pace of daily life. Slow adoption, gradual trust, repeated handling. These patterns define its role. Paper's continued use does not suggest resistance to change. It suggests compatibility with human habits. It suggests patience. As technologies evolve, paper remains available. It offers a surface that feels familiar and steady. It supports thought without distraction. The story of paper does not require conclusion. It continues in ordinary moments. Each use adds another layer. Paper remains where it has always been, within reach, quietly waiting.